So my name is Shiva, and I'm from Biopeak. I'm one of the founders of Biopeak. Now, this is going to be an interesting conversation because I think Nikita made my life very easy by setting in context the whole sustainability and health piece already together. So let me quickly tell you about what longevity means in India. Now, longevity is a wonderful word, but what does it mean for us? It may mean living longer, yes, but what else does it mean? And actually, from an Indian context, this means something very different. It means the quality of life. So here's what's really interesting. Most people are actually suffering towards the end of the life. You may live for a long time, but you may be wheelchair-bound. You may have diseases. And if you notice, all of those thresholds actually happen at the latter period of your life, right? So this is one of the projects that Biopeak actually embarks to solve. And one of the first things over here with what Biopeak does is detect. And what does that mean to us? It's not just detecting cancers, but what we actually are doing today, from an Indian context, is looking at South Asian data, and we're saying for every person, can we get their genomic signature, right? The whole exome of how a person's blueprint is for this life. Now, that is just a probability chart. You may or may not express those genetics. And you know what decides that? That's your environment. And that's what Nikita was talking about earlier today. What I will try to do in this next 8 minutes is actually to show you the continuum of how the biology of each individual is actually influenced by their environment. And actually, it's one and the same. We are this organism in the soup of our environment, which shapes our very reality and our biology in this case, right? And the testing that we do is from the genetics, we actually test the cell. And we have 37 trillion cells. So imagine if I change one cell, that we change the trajectory of 37 trillion cells. And that is a compounding version of how we could arrive at health. Now, each one of the cells have something called mitochondria, and they may have 40,000 odd mitochondria. And if you influence anything over there, then you influence metabolism as we know it. So our journey was interesting, right? We wanted to go and look at the smallest common denominator and look at how it expresses itself, as life itself, and within this soup, in this context of our environment, right, which is Bangalore for us today. And I'll just go to the next slide. Okay, so this is very interesting for me, because today I'm going to tell you what we found, right? So we've been operational and doing this work for 10 years, and Biopeak is just 1 year old, which comes up with all the testing, everything that we can possibly think of, not only on a cellular level, but from there we look at all the imaging data. So we're looking at things like your MRI, your whole digital MRI of your body. Then we're looking at what's happening with your heart, with the CT scoring. We're looking at what's happening in your gut with the microbiome. And then we integrate all these pieces of information, right? And we know what's really interesting. The single most important thing seems to be what you're exposed to. And if you look at that, that's the human exposome over there, right? Everything, and the built environment is on top of that. And I think a lot of the conversation today was about the built environment. And then what I'm talking about is the human exposome. And all the little cells and stuff like that is in the systems biology. And all that leads into this idea of what healthy or qualitative living is. Now, let me tell you a really interesting story. So we've done 400 odd clients in the last 7 months. And here are some interesting pieces that was very, very unique, right, for an Indian populace. It's every part of India is so diverse that the first thing we found is that you have unique microbial signatures if you're from the west, the east, the north, or the south. Not only our food, but even our weather, the tropical environment, or the kind of air you're exposed to seems to be tuning your microbiome of your gut. And the microbiome of the gut tunes your immune system. So if you go back and actually look at this as a holistic vision of life, I want you to think of things like in the context of cancer, for example, which I think today we're almost 1 in 7 people who are exposed to some kind of, I suppose, possibility of cancer, right? And what actually solves for cancer is your immune system, right? And if you look at the way that our immune system is being actually exposed and what it's exposed to and how it actually translates into this possibility of self-healing even, right? It all comes down to the fact of what you're exposed to. And that's really interesting for me because, for example, every single part of the table and the chairs that you touch today are influenced by everybody else who's touched that. So imagine that you're tuning your immune system today based on what's on the surface of that table, depends on who you last touched that table. And imagine how sensitive our body is to every single thing. So it's interesting when you actually come to it, and it's what Nikita spoke about as well, about that whole certificate of an immune building, if you will, right? And this is the same thing. If you invert it, it's how I can influence my own immunity to not only fight viruses, but also to deal with things like cancer. And hence, the threshold or the load of what's coming in from the environment is so crucial for health. Let me give you a good example. When you look at tribes like the Hazda and the Shuar, do you know that they're much smaller than, you say, the average person? And that's because their immune systems consume almost 10% of whatever energy that they have because of the amount of parasites and pathogens they're exposed to. And if you look at our kids today from like 50 years ago, you'll see a huge size increase in our whole average height than from before. So imagine that all of that is happening because of your environment and because of our pathogen loads. Now, going back to that last conversation about how sustainability and how environmentally sound architecture or even the air affects you, that's how acute this whole journey is. And for us right now, we're able to map the internal biology. But unless it's a continuum of what's happening from the outside, it's impossible to actually solve for what this word longevity actually means. I want to show you this because for every single person, what we actually do, we're talking about health and AI, right? So this is exactly what happens. This is possible because of what has happened today with our ability to use AI. So over here, you see this chart. It's actually a digital twin of your biology. And what it does over here is you take an individual, right? And you map his stress levels, you map what he's exposed to, you take all of that. And then you build a network of possibilities of saying, where does all of that arrive at in his personal biology of his problem? And then you'll realize that, it's like 40% from the environment. It's like 20% from his diet. It's like 30% from his microbes because of some village that he visited at some point, and that pathogen from that village has actually gotten to his gut. And it's actually amazing that every day we live with this, but we have no visibility of our biology, right? And here's what makes this interesting. This actually gives us that ability to map what's happening on the outside world on your inside world. And it actually does the whole network for you. Let me give you a great example of this, right? We have somebody coming in with issues, in their gut. But while you're mapping their gut, you'll find a certain fungal loads, right, that you actually see in the gut. But that comes in from, their houses and mold that sits on the wall. There's an interesting story for me. This is an Olympian who came in. And, they're traveling all over playing badminton. And this particular person was exposed to a wet patch on a wall. But unfortunately, he had no ability to deal with that toxin or that mycotoxin that actually landed in his body. He lost 3 years, right, based on this one toxin. And the way that we figured it out is that we found this one small, fungal piece in his gut. And we had to go back and check his home. And we found out that he had a wet patch. It's a tropical country, old pipes, it's just quite normal. And what we had to do is actually repaint it and actually fix the leaks and all of that stuff at home. So interestingly, that was what his exposure was. And nobody will think about this, right? And this is the kind of work that we're finding that, it's health within and without, right? We have to be able to look at the details. And this is the advent of what we're able to do because of what artificial intelligence is able to help a human do today. So over here, you see something interesting. I think we already discussed this earlier. The HPA axis is your stress axis. But if you look at it, it actually leads down all the way down into systemic inflammation. And in this case, this person has an issue with a cardiovascular risk. And we actually found even plaque building up, right? Now, very interesting, right? How much of that is stress-oriented, and what can we do about that axis? And this is how we address every single individual who comes through our clinic. But it's what we're finding more and more is like we have no choice but to go back and always look at the soup or the environment that they've actually come in from. So this is what I wanted to actually talk about, like at the end. It's actually a continuum, right? You cannot look at an organism in isolation of its environment. And this is the kind of work that we have to do, and anything to do with longevity has to be anchored in with the continuum of your environment, obviously. I can also tell you another interesting story. So we have a spectroscopy meter that reads like, the amount of heavy metals that you have. Now, here's what's really interesting. We are seeing a lot of fatty liver, as a problem. But here's what's most interesting for us is one of the big issues with fatty liver is heavy metals, because nobody ever looks at heavy metals. And today we find that things like lead are sort of chronically everywhere as deposits in the body. And that actually cuts down a lot of your detoxification pathways, which means that's an issue with the liver. So I think that we need to view these things differently today. So how do you make an organism resilient enough to be able to deal with these privations of our modern day living? That's the internal part of it. And if you think about it as a limited resource of how much I'm able to deal with, how can I reduce the burden of my environment? And hence, this is the continuum of longevity. And I just wanted to leave you with a thought that this has got nothing to do with us in isolation at all, and that most of longevity actually comes from the outside. But we have the ability today to look at those individual elements, and the interesting part is none of us will have the same problems. Some people will be able to take lead out of the system, other people can't. Some people will have an issue with one mycotoxin in the air, the other guy doesn't. So it looks like we have to head for a precision orientation, right? And it's completely possible today, because not only, as Nikita said, do you have the ability to test outside, but you also have the ability to test inside. And I leave you with this thought that the future of, anything to do with health has to be a continuum where we can present the data of both together, right? And that's the only way you can have the static and the dynamic systems of health unified. Thank you.